Libraries are an important part of our society, and there are different types of libraries that exist for different reasons. We have medical libraries, music libraries, law libraries, and libraries for associations, nonprofits, and all types of business and corporations. The most common types of libraries in the US are school, academic, and public libraries. To better understand libraries today, we'll look back at how each of these types have come to be, with particular focus on public libraries. We'll look at the library as an organization and a movement, as well as some of the people who influenced its development over the years. Here you see the reading room at the Library of Congress, which began when our country began, and is the largest library in the world. Also pictured is Augusta Baker, who was a groundbreaking Black librarian who spent some time here at the iSchool as our storyteller in residence after she retired from the New York Public Library after 30 plus years there. There are many, many interesting stories to tell, and we're just going to scratch the surface in this overview. Today in the US, there are more than 17,000 public library locations. That includes almost 700 bookmobiles. That's more public libraries than there are McDonald's locations in the US. There are over 3,600 academic libraries at colleges and universities, and more than 90,000 school libraries for K-12 education. Today, libraries are a central feature of most US communities, but it wasn't always that way. The first libraries in North America showed up before the US even existed. The sharing of books was inspired by the Enlightenment, which was a period of social change during the 18th century. Its central idea was that human beings all had powers of logic and reasoning that they could use to improve themselves and increase their knowledge about the world. Instead of relying on stories and superstition, people began to value facts and seek them. That was when the scientific method became more widely used. At this time, books were expensive and scarce, so it made sense to share them. Wealthy, educated men formed groups that worked together to create book collections they all could use. They would charge an annual fee or subscription to members, and they used the money from the subscriptions to improve their collections. So subscribers became part owners in the library and had some say in what was put in the collection and how the library is run. This type of library was called a subscription library, and the first subscription library was founded in Philadelphia in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin and some of his friends. They called it the Library Company of Philadelphia, and it still exists today, complete with many of the original books in its collection. Charleston Library Society was founded in 1748. All of these are still in existence. And during the Civil War, interestingly, the Charleston Library Society's collection was moved to Columbia. Some went to USC and some was sent to the State House. Those at the State House were destroyed in a Union attack by General Sherman. And if you wanted to join the Charleston Library Society today, the basic membership is $150 a year, $250 for families, but you can spend up to $10,000 per year for, like the premium membership where you get extra privileges at the Library Society. The Boston Athenaeum is important because it was so instrumental in establishing the Free Public Library in Boston several decades later. These early subscription libraries were established by and for highly educated, wealthy white men. But later we see examples of libraries created by and for the Black community, as well as for women and working people. From the Library Company of Philadelphia's website, we can read, in the 1820s and 30s, subscription libraries flourished in Black communities in the urban North. These membership literary societies had book collections, reading rooms, lectures, and debates. Some were founded by and were for Black women, although many were for men only. Perhaps the best known of these societies was founded in 1833 when the Black population in Philadelphia formed the Philadelphia Library Company of Colored Persons, which had a membership fee of $1 per year. And it was housed in the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, which you see pictured here. This society operated for at least until 1862. Other subscription libraries were started by women's clubs and associations for working people, like the Mechanics Societies that formed in several cities. The New York Mechanics Society opened the Apprentices Library in 1820, and by 1878 it had 8,000 members and circulated 600 books daily. It still exists and is now called the General Society Library, and there's a picture of that library today. As the 1800s advanced, the thinking around libraries was starting to change, due mainly to two factors. First, the cost of books. By the early 1800s, printing was becoming faster and cheaper, so there were more materials available, not just scholarly, intellectual, or religious books, but some more popular reading materials like novels and magazines that people would read for entertainment. The second factor was the rising rate of literacy among the general population. Public education was starting to take hold, so the general public was becoming more literate. And even though they still might not be able to afford to buy books, they did want to have access to these popular reading materials, as well as educational books that helped them explore the world. All of this led to the establishment of so-called circulating libraries. These were different from subscription libraries, both because of their collections, which were not so much intended to educate the reader as to entertain them, and because of their affordability. Circulating libraries charged a very small annual fee, and they could do this because they were often housed in shops, like the one pictured here, rather than having their own building. These libraries were where the average person could go for reading materials, and they popped up everywhere, from shops like this one to library boats that traveled up and down the Erie Canal. Circulating libraries thrived during the first half of the 19th century, and after the Civil War, book prices dropped further and more middle-class people could buy books of their own. This led to a decline in the number of these circulating libraries by the turn of the 20th century. At the same time, a lot of people were working to find a way to provide freely available books to entire communities funded by the government. Now we see the first true public libraries showing up. And these are three that claim to be firsts in different aspects of their establishment. So Boston Public Library in 1848 was the first publicly supported free municipal library in the world. Then right below there, we see the Petersboro, New Hampshire Library that was established in 1833. So that was earlier than the Boston Public, but it's different because this was a public collection, but it was housed in a general store. So people would it still didn't have a dedicated library building until 60 years later in 1893. But this public library in a general store, they would print their catalog each year and distribute it through the community so people could look and see what they had available in their collection, which was kind of innovative at the time. And then in 1857, Oswego in New York, upstate New York, established America's oldest public library, still in its original building. So that building was the library in 1857, and it still is the library today, which is pretty cool. In general, few libraries were established in the South before the turn of the 20th century. Southern states spent many years recovering from the Civil War and the social consequences of that. So that impeded them from spending money on public libraries. Also, the South was a lot more rural, and at that time than the Northeast had a lot more dense population. For the most part, academic and school libraries came along earlier than public libraries in the US. Early school libraries consisted of whatever books the teacher had on hand, and there weren't necessarily formal libraries for children in schools. But the first school library with a dedicated library space is thought to have been at the Penn Charter School in Philadelphia, which was established in 1744 and still operates. Um, and you could see a picture of their library there on the left today. So that's looks like a pretty fancy school. Um, and today, most schools in the US do include a library. Academic libraries also began for the most part as a collection of books that didn't have any common dedicated space, so they didn't have their own building. For example, although Harvard was established in 1638, its library did not have its own building, and over 200 years later, 1887. So before that, the collection was kind of spread out, and books and materials on like psychology would be, housed in the psychology building or even the office of the psychology professor. They weren't usually checked out to students. They might informally borrow them from the professor, but mostly they were used to create, lectures and classroom information. The picture on the right is the South Caroliniana Library at USC. This was the first freestanding college library in the United States, opening in 1840, and it was constructed at a cost of $15,000. This is a picture of the library in 1900, so it's already 60 years old. And this building is still in use, still a library. It was renovated recently, just reopened like maybe 5 years ago, and it's just a gorgeous, beautiful library. It's great to visit. They've retained a lot of the original features of the library. So students and researchers could come here and use the collection. But like most libraries back then, you couldn't just go over to the shelf and pull a book off and read it, and you could not check books out. So what you do is find out what they had that you were interested in, write it on a slip of paper, give it to the librarian at the desk, and they would go retrieve the book for you. You could use it in the building, and then you had to leave it with the librarian when you left. So that was the earliest freestanding college library in the US. As the 1800s end and the 20th century begins, people begin to see libraries as an essential asset to any community, and new sources of funding emerge. One very important new source of funding was wealthy philanthropists looking to improve their communities and encourage the average citizen to improve their lives through learning and logic. These philanthropists were extremely wealthy industrialists who just made a lot of money in the late 1800s. One of the best known philanthropists in the US was Andrew Carnegie. Thanks to his ownership of ironworks, railroads, and the Carnegie Steel Corporation, as well as his practice of paying very low wages to his workers, Andrew Carnegie became the world's richest man in the late 19th and early 20th century. He spent the later years of his life giving away huge sums of money. He gave away the equivalent of 6.5 billion in our dollars over the course of about 30 years. Funded buildings and collections for around 2,500 libraries, 1,600 of those in the US, between 1883 and 1929. In 1905, more than half of all public libraries in the US were Carnegie libraries. And this map shows how they were distributed at that time around the US. You can see they're really concentrated in the Northeast, and that's again because of the population density in the Northeast, and also, especially in New England, libraries, each little town and village had their own separate library. There weren't big library systems with lots of branches. There were just individual small libraries and rural libraries throughout New England. So, and as we said in the South, it took a little bit longer for libraries to start to show up. So Carnegie funded these libraries by providing the community would provide the land, but Carnegie would build the buildings. And he also funded some separate libraries for African American people whose communities would not allow integrated libraries. Carnegie also funded over 100 academic libraries in the US. Many of these were at smaller private colleges, including Mercer University and Agnes Scott College near Atlanta, as well as Benedict College in Columbia and Converse College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And these photos on the bottom are from Converse College. On the left, you see the original Carnegie building. Well, the building's in both pictures, but on the left, you see the day that they were moving their collection from their Carnegie building to a larger new library. And the librarians organized the campus so that there was a line of students and faculty that stretched from the old building to the new building, and they passed the collection hand to hand from one building to the other down the line. So fortunately, they kept the building and it's now used for offices and meeting space. It looks really looks great. So that's awesome. Another philanthropist who had a huge influence on the development of libraries in the US was Julius Rosenwald. He made his fortune in retail with Sears, Roebuck and Company. And he had a social conscience. He once said, "What I want to do is try and cure the things that seem wrong." He recognized the lack of educational opportunities for Black children in the Jim Crow South, so he helped fund construction of more than 5,000 Rosenwald schools in the South, starting in 1913. He would provide seed money for these school projects, and the recipients matched those funds and contributed labor, land, and materials to make the plan a reality. And down at the bottom of the screen, you can see the committee or the leaders who established one of those Rosenwald schools. He also supported the establishment of more than 10,000 school, college, and public libraries, and funded library science programs that trained African American librarians. Rosenwald was a strong advocate for the need for libraries to be supported by local governments because that wasn't happening yet in most places. U.S. society underwent a lot of changes in the early 20th century, and in response, libraries began to pay more attention to marginalized groups and the library's role in helping solve social problems. As they became more established, libraries began to consider which groups in society were not being served. This reflected a trend in libraries and other community institutions toward becoming more involved in solving social problems. Two trends that influenced libraries in that period between the world wars were immigration and the isolation of rural communities. For both of those groups, outreach became a very important aspect of library work. In the early 20th century, libraries worked to serve rural areas where people were isolated due to there being fewer roads and limited transportation. Phones were just coming into use, and most rural residents didn't have phones or even electricity in their homes, which meant that they couldn't even listen to the radio. So they were very isolated in their little communities. So for libraries, an important development and outreach at this time was the bookmobile, and this was also the era when we see librarians on horseback appearing in very rural areas. Libraries began to go where the people were. Outreach became an important element of library work. The early part of the 20th century saw waves of immigration from Europe and elsewhere, and libraries played an important role in helping new arrivals navigate their new home. Libraries offered English language classes, citizenship preparation, cultural programming and materials, and they had books and story times in languages other than English. Libraries offered a place to gather with others who'd had similar experiences. We know that newcomers rely on their friends and families for tips on how to get along in a new place, and libraries just helped bring those people together. And this picture on the left shows children at the Los Angeles Public Library dressed in costumes from different countries, and the library's collection included books in all of those languages. And then on the left, you see a pamphlet produced by the American Library Association that was designed to help libraries working with a large immigrant population. Another way that libraries worked to address social issues was their response to segregation and the broader civil rights movement. 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson was the court case that decided that it was legal to have separate public facilities for Black and white people as long as the quality of the facilities was equal. But we know there was a huge difference in what facilities for Black people looked like versus those for whites. The idea of separate but equal facilities for people of color didn't work any better in libraries than it did in US society as a whole. And you see pictured here the first public library in the US for African Americans, which was built in 1905 in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was funded by Andrew Carnegie. Then below we see kind of a summary of a very brief summary of the development of libraries in Atlanta. The first public library was established in 1902, but it wasn't until 1921 that there was a branch that was open to people of color. And it was just one branch in the entire city, so very little access for people of color at that time. In 1959, the Atlanta Fulton County system was officially desegregated, but in the beginning, African American people were only allowed to read books in the basement of the central library, and they couldn't check books out. So they only had a very limited access to the collection at the main branch of the library, and they couldn't check books out. The first person got a library card to borrow books at an Atlanta library in 1961. So securing inclusive library services took the combined efforts of community leaders, governments, and civic groups, educators, and philanthropists who worked together to find funding and convince the local government that libraries should be publicly funded and open to all. There is still more work to do. But as you'll learn in this first module, we are guided by professional principles that emphasize access and equity. Our ideas about what public libraries should be have evolved over time, and library practice has always reflected the issues and values of our society. Libraries have been able to adjust to changing conditions and needs in their communities. We know that public libraries are a bargain, and they're a smart investment for local governments. Studies show that every $1 a community spends on public libraries generates an average of $4 to $5 in economic benefits. Like they create jobs and they provide services like internet access, meeting space, and access to their collections. And then the library also, of course, purchases goods and services in the community. So it's great for the local economy. And there are other benefits of libraries that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Libraries continue to provide a lot of value both to individuals and society as a whole. It's good for us to understand how libraries got to where they are today and appreciate how they're able to adjust and evolve so they continue to be useful in a changing world. Thanks for watching.